I have told this story maybe 100 times now, and every single time my hands go cold when I reach the part about the boy with the red balloon. People always think the worst part of that morning was the noise. It wasn't. The worst part was the quiet that came after, and in the middle of all that quiet, there was one man who did not move. I will get to him. Let me start where it started, because if I jump straight to the end, you won't understand why I still can't walk past that corner without slowing down. My name doesn't matter much. I sold flowers near the edge of the park for 19 years. Same spot, more or less. A little metal stall, a green awning that leaked when it rained, buckets of carnations and roses and those cheap tulips that the tourists loved because they were bright and didn't cost the earth. I knew that corner the way you know your own kitchen. I knew which paving stones rocked under your shoe. I knew the man who fed the pigeons at 7:30 every morning and pretended he didn't. I knew the guards. You don't really think about them as people at first. That's the truth of it. When you work near the barracks long enough, the guards become part of the scenery, like the railings, like the trees. They stand there in their dark coats, those tall caps swallowing half their faces, and the tourists line up to take photographs and pull silly faces and try to make them laugh. The guards never laugh. They stare straight ahead at nothing, or at something only they can see, and after a while you stop wondering what's going on behind those eyes. You just assume there's nothing. You assume they're statues that happen to breathe. I was wrong about that. I learned how wrong on a Tuesday in early autumn. It had rained in the night. I remember because the buckets were full and I had to tip them out before I could set up, and the water was cold enough to make me swear. The morning came up gray, and then, around 9, the sun broke through in that thin, watery way it does in London, where it doesn't really warm you, it just makes everything look a bit kinder. The leaves were turning. There were brown ones stuck to the pavement, flattened by the rain into little shapes like hands. I swept them off my patch and dumped them in the gutter, and thought it was going to be an ordinary day. The tourists started early. They always did when the weather was decent. Coaches pulled in down the road and let out streams of people with cameras and folding maps and those clear plastic ponchos they bought in a panic and never needed. I heard about 5 languages before 10 o'clock. A group of schoolchildren in matching yellow caps, holding a long rope so they wouldn't get lost, the teacher counting them over and over like she didn't trust the number. A couple on their honeymoon, you could tell, because they kept stopping to kiss in the way that makes everyone else look away and smile. An old man with a camera that must have been 40 years old, the kind with the strap and the lens cap on a string, taking his time, framing every shot like it mattered. And the guard. There was one in particular who I'd watched for the better part of a year. I didn't know his name then. I learned it later, and I'll tell you when it's time. But that morning he was just the young one. He was tall, of course, they're all tall, but there was something about the way he held himself that I'd noticed across the seasons. Some of them shift their weight. You can see it if you watch long enough, this tiny sway, a man trying to keep the blood moving in his legs without breaking the stillness. Not him. He stood like the stone behind him had decided to grow a uniform, dead still, the kind of still that takes work, the kind of still that hurts. The tourists loved him for it. That morning a young woman stood about a foot from his face and waved her hand in front of his eyes slow, like she was checking if he was alive. Her friends were filming it, laughing. He didn't blink, didn't twitch. She gave up after a bit and pulled a face for the camera, and they moved on, and I remember thinking, good lad, you didn't give them anything. Because that's the game, isn't it? People want to crack you. They want to be the one who made the guards smile. And the guards know that if they break for one, they break for all, and then the whole thing falls apart. There was a boy near him, maybe 4 years old, maybe 5. Hard to tell with little ones. He had a red balloon tied to his wrist with a bit of curling ribbon, the helium kind that bobs along above your head, and he was utterly mesmerized by the guard. Not laughing at him, not trying to make him crack, just staring up, mouth open, the way small children look at things they've decided are magic. His mum was a few feet back on her phone, half watching, the way you do when you think you're in a safe place. And the boy kept inching closer to the guard, and then losing his nerve and scuttling back to his mum's leg, and then inching closer again. It was the sweetest thing. I remember smiling at it from behind my buckets. I sold a bunch of yellow roses to a man who said they were for his wife's birthday, and he was nervous about it, fussing over whether yellow meant friendship instead of love. And I told him yellow means whatever you want it to mean, mate, and he laughed and gave me an extra pound and walked off happy. Small thing. I think about it now. How happy he was over a pound of roses. How none of us knew. It was about 10:20. I was wrapping a bouquet, my back half turned when I felt it before I heard it. That's the part people never believe, but it's true. There was a pressure first. A push in the air, like a door slamming in a house with all the windows shut. That thump you feel in your chest before your ears catch up. And then the sound came, and the sound was wrong. It wasn't loud the way thunder is loud. It was loud the way the end of something is loud. It came up through the pavement and into my legs, and the buckets jumped and water slopped over the rims, and the whole world went white for a second. Just white. Like someone had pulled a sheet over my eyes. I don't know if I sat down or fell. I was on the ground either way. My ears were screaming. Not ringing, screaming this high thin note that filled my whole head and pushed everything else out. I remember looking at my own hands on the wet pavement and not understanding why they were shaking. The flowers were everywhere, roses in the gutter, a whole bucket on its side, rolling, tulips spilling out like something bleeding. There was smoke down the road, off towards the trees, a gray-black cloud climbing fast, and the smell hit me a beat later. This chemical bitterness that caught the back of my throat and made me gag. Then the screaming started, the human kind. It's a sound I cannot describe properly, and I've stopped trying. It came from everywhere at once. Down the road near the park gate where the smoke was. People were running, but not in one direction. That's the thing nobody tells you. They ran every which way into each other, away from nothing, towards nothing. A woman went past me so fast her shoe came off and she didn't stop for it. The schoolteacher with the yellow caps was shrieking numbers, counting, grabbing children and shoving them behind a parked van. The honeymoon couple were just frozen, holding each other, his mouth moving but no sound that I could hear over the screaming in my own skull. I got up. I don't know how. My knees didn't want to hold me. I grabbed the edge of my stall and the metal was cold, and that cold was the only real thing in the whole world for a second, so I held it. And that's when I looked towards the barracks. The young guard was still standing. I want you to understand what that looked like. All around him, chaos. People on the ground, people running, a haze of dust and smoke drifting across the road, alarms starting up somewhere, a car alarm, then another, a horrible wailing chorus. And in the middle of it, this one figure, dark coat, tall cap, rifle held the way they hold it, perfectly upright, perfectly still. He had not moved. The blast had been close enough that the dust had reached him. I could see it settling on his shoulders, a gray film, and he had not so much as flinched. I thought he was in shock. That was my first thought. I thought, poor lad, he's frozen, somebody needs to get him out of there. Because surely no person could stand still in that. Surely it was a body doing what a body does when the mind has fled, just locking up. I almost called out to him. Then I saw his eyes. He was scanning. Slow, deliberate, left to right and back, his head barely moving but his eyes working the whole scene, and I understood with a kind of cold drop in my stomach that he was not frozen at all. He was the only person on that entire road who was thinking. Everyone else was running on animal fear. Including me, he was reading it. The smoke, the people, the road, the gates behind him, making decisions I couldn't begin to follow. He wasn't a statue that had locked up. He was a man doing exactly what he'd been built to do. In the one moment it actually counted, and it was the most frightening and the most steadying thing I have ever seen in my life. Because here's what your body wants to do when the world explodes. It wants to run. Every cell of you is screaming, move, get away, live. I felt it. I felt the pull of it like a current trying to drag me down the road. And to stand against that, to plant your feet and stay, when staying might be the very thing that kills you, When the smart money says the next one could be right where you're standing, I didn't have a word for that then. I'm not sure I have one now. People say bravery. Bravery's too small. Bravery is a word for jumping in cold water. This was something else. A second blast did not come. We didn't know that yet, of course. In those first minutes, every one of us was waiting for it. That's what made it unbearable. You don't just survive the bang. You survive the wait for the next one. And the guard stood through that wait. He stood through the part where the rest of us would have given anything to be a mile away. I started moving towards the smoke. I don't know why. You'd think you'd go the other way, and most did, but something in me went towards it. Maybe because I'd worked that corner so long it felt like mine, like my street was hurt and I had to see. I stumbled past the parked van where the teacher had her children crammed, all of them crying, the yellow caps bright and ridiculous against all that gray. I went past a man sitting on the curb holding his own arm and staring at it like it belonged to a stranger. I kept going. And then I remembered the boy. The boy with the red balloon. I stopped dead. I spun round back towards the barracks, scanning the ground, the pavement, the running shapes, and my heart was going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Where was he? Where was the little one who'd been inching towards the guard? I'd seen him not 2 minutes before the world ended, and now I couldn't find him, and the not finding was worse than anything. It opened a hole in me. His mum was on the ground. I saw her then. She'd been knocked down or thrown down near the railings, and she was up on her hands and screaming a name I couldn't hear, screaming it at the smoke, at the road, at the sky. And she was trying to crawl, and her leg wasn't working right, and she kept collapsing back down and screaming the name again. And the balloon. I saw the balloon first. That stupid, beautiful red balloon, bobbing along at about the height of a small child's head, drifting, moving out near the middle of the road, out where the smoke was thickest, out towards the gate where nobody in their right mind would go. The ribbon was still tied to a little wrist. The boy was walking, not running. Walking, dazed, wandering, the way the very young do when something has scrambled their world and they've simply set off looking for the nearest familiar thing. And the nearest familiar thing, in that whole nightmare, the one fixed point he had decided was safe, was the man in the dark coat who had never once moved. He was walking to the guard, through the open road, through the smoke, towards the gate, and I understood in the same instant 3 things, and they hit me one after another like a fist: that the boy was walking into the most dangerous patch of ground on that street, that his mother could not reach him, and that the only person close enough to do anything about it was a soldier under orders to hold a post, who had stood like stone through a bomb, and who had not moved a single inch in all the time I had ever watched him. The balloon bobbed. The little legs carried him on. The red of it was the brightest thing in the whole gray world. And I held my breath and I watched the guard, and I waited to see what a statue would do. For a moment, nothing. The guard did not move and the boy kept walking, and I thought, with a flat, horrible certainty, he won't. He can't. He's under orders. He'll stand there and watch like the rest of us, and that little one will walk into the smoke, and that will be that. I have never wanted to be wrong about anything so badly in my whole life. The mother screamed the name again, and this time the wind dropped or my ears came back because I heard it. Theo. She was screaming Theo, and the boy Theo didn't turn round. He was past hearing. He was in that locked little world the very young go into when the bigness of the world has knocked them sideways, and the only thing in his world was the man in the dark coat, and he was going to get to him. And then the guard moved. I'll tell you exactly what it looked like because I've gone over it more times than I can count, and the picture never blurs. It wasn't a panic. That's what got me. A normal man, a good man even, would have lurched, broken into a clumsy run, all arms and fear. He didn't. He came off that post like a door swinging open, smooth, fast, no wasted motion. The rifle went from upright across his body in the same movement, secured, controlled. And then he was running, and he was quick, far quicker than you'd think a man could be in that coat and those boots, and he was running straight at the boy and straight at the smoke. People talk about slow motion. I always thought that was a film thing, an invention. It isn't. I watched him cross that road and time stretched out like warm toffee. I saw his boots hit the wet tarmac. I saw the dust kicking up off his shoulders. I saw a piece of paper, a leaflet, somebody's tourist map, blow across the gap between him and the child, and I remember thinking, mad as it sounds, don't let that map trip him. As if a map could matter. As if anything could matter except the closing distance between a soldier and a 4-year-old, in the middle of an open road, that might go up again at any second. He reached the boy. He didn't snatch him roughly. That stayed with me too. In the worst moment, with no time at all, he was still gentle. He scooped Theo up off the ground with one arm, swept him in against his chest, and turned his own body so that his back was towards the smoke and the gate and whatever might still be out there. He put himself between the child and the danger, his back to it, his whole body a wall. The balloon snapped its ribbon somewhere in the scramble and went up, that red dot rising over the rooftops. And I watched it go, and I had this lump in my throat the size of a fist. And then he ran again, the boy clamped to his chest, the little legs dangling, and he came back across the road faster than he'd gone out, and he was making for the railings where the mother was. But he didn't reach her first. Here's the thing, nobody got on their phones because the phones were down or held by shaking hands, and I think that's a shame because it was the part that mattered. There was a second child. I hadn't seen her. None of us had. A little girl, smaller than Theo even, who'd been knocked behind a fallen barrier near the gate, half hidden, not moving much, just curled up with her hands over her ears the way children do when the noise is too big. The guard saw her. As he was running back with Theo, he saw her, and he changed his line. He didn't drop the boy and he didn't slow down properly. He just bent his whole run towards her, and as he passed he got his free arm down and round her and lifted her too. And now he had a child on each side, the boy against his chest and the girl in the crook of his other arm, and he kept going. 2 of them. He carried 2 of them out. I've thought about the weight of that. 2 children in that coat, in those boots, over wet ground, with your own heart presumably trying to climb out of your mouth. And he ran it like it was nothing. Like the only number in his head was 2 and the only direction was away. He brought them to the railings. He went down on one knee, careful, even then, careful, and he set the boy into his mother's arms, and she grabbed Theo and folded over him and made a sound I will hear until I die. This animal sound that is the opposite of a scream, the sound of getting back the thing you'd already given up. And the little girl, he held on to, looking round fast, eyes working the crowd, looking for whoever she belonged to. And a man came stumbling out of the chaos with blood on his face and his arms out, and the guard passed the girl to him, and the man went to his knees with her and just held on. And then the guard stood up. That's the part. He stood up and he turned round, back towards the smoke, and he scanned again, looking for the next one, for anybody else, for anyone who needed carrying out of the dark. And when he didn't find a child, he started moving among the adults, the ones on the ground. Crouching to them, his mouth moving, hands steady. I couldn't hear what he was saying. I learned later it was the simple things. You're all right. Help's coming. Stay with me. Stay still. The same few words over and over, calm as a Sunday, while everything around him still smelled of burning and the alarm still wailed, and not one of us knew if there was a second device counting down somewhere under a bin or a parked car. I'd like to say I was useful. I wasn't, not at first. I stood by my wrecked stall with flowers around my feet and I shook. Then something in me caught up to the moment, maybe shame, maybe just the sight of him doing it, and I started moving too. I went to the man on the curb who was holding his arm. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat with him and held his good hand and told him daft things, that the buses would be running again before he knew it, that I'd buy him a pint, anything, just words to keep him here. He gripped my hand so hard it bruised. He kept saying, "Is it over? Is it over?" And I kept saying yes even though I didn't know, because what else do you say? The first sirens came then. You always think they take forever, but I think it was fast, really, it just felt like forever. Police first, then the ambulances, then more police, and after them the ones in the heavy gear, the bomb people, moving in their slow, deliberate way that tells you the danger isn't done. They flooded the road. They started pushing us back, all of us, away from the smoke, setting up a line, and there were so many of them so quickly that the chaos began slowly to turn into something with edges, something being handled. And through all of it, the guard kept working. The police tried to move him too. At one point, a young officer put a hand on his shoulder and said something, trying to pull him back behind the line, and the guard just looked at him and shook his head once and went back to the woman he was kneeling beside, an older lady who'd come down hard and couldn't get her breath, and he stayed with her, his hand light on her shoulder, talking, until the paramedics could reach her. Then he let them take over. Then he found the next one. I want to be honest about something, because if I dress this up it stops being true. There was a stretch in the middle of all that where I hated him a little. That sounds mad. But I watched him be so calm, so capable, while I was useless and shaking, and some small ugly part of me thought, how dare you? How are you doing that? What's wrong with you that you can do that? It took me a long time to understand that what I was feeling wasn't really about him. It was about me, about the gap between what I'd done and what I'd wanted to be able to do. He just stood in that gap, lit up, showing me the size of it. People don't always love you for that. There was a moment, maybe 20 minutes in, when it got to him. I saw it, just for a second. He'd handed off the last person he could help, and there was a lull, a strange pocket of stillness in the middle of the noise, and he stood there at the edge of the cordon and his shoulders dropped. Just an inch, just for a breath. And he reached up and took off the cap, that tall, heavy cap, and I saw his face properly for the first time, and he was young, younger than I'd thought. There was gray dust caked in his eyebrows and a thin line of blood from a cut above his ear that he didn't seem to know about, and his jaw was working, and his eyes were too bright. And for 1 second he looked exactly like what he was, which was a frightened young man a very long way from home. He breathed. Once. Twice. You could see him putting himself back together with his bare hands, gathering it all up, the fear and the horror, folding it down small and putting it somewhere he could deal with it later. Then he put the cap back on, and he was the statue again. And he turned to a senior officer who'd come for him and gave a report, crisp, quick, pointing, telling them where people were, who he'd moved, what he'd seen before the blast, and the officer was nodding and writing and looking at this lad with something I can only call awe. I learned his name from that officer weeks later when I gave my own account of the day. Whitlock. Lance Corporal Daniel Whitlock, 23 years old. From somewhere up north, a town I'd never heard of, the kind of place that doesn't make the news for anything good. He'd been in the Army 4 years. He'd been on that particular post for 11 months. 11 months of standing still, while strangers waved hands in his face and pulled faces, and tried to make him crack. 11 months of being treated like part of the railings, like scenery, like a statue that happened to breathe. And on a Tuesday in early autumn, the scenery moved. I keep coming back to that. We'd all decided what he was. The crowds, the tourists, me, all of us, we'd looked at the guards 1,000 times and decided there was nothing behind the eyes, that the stillness was emptiness, that a man who could stand like that for hours must have switched off the part of himself that feels. We were so wrong. The stillness wasn't emptiness. The stillness was a discipline, and the discipline was the thing that let him keep his head when hours all left us. The same training that made him stand like stone, while a girl waved her hand in his face, was the training that let him run into smoke and come back with 2 children and not fall apart. It was all the same thing. The boring part and the brave part were the same thing. We'd just only ever seen the boring part, and we'd mistaken it for the whole man. They closed the road for days. My stall was inside the cordon and I couldn't get to it for the better part of a week, and when I finally did, the flowers were long dead, brown slime in the buckets, but somebody, some officer or some kind stranger, had stood my fallen stall back up and gathered the worst of the mess. Small thing. I cried over it, standing there, more than I'd cried on the day itself. Funny how that works. You hold it together through the bomb, and then a tidied up flower stall finishes you off. The honeymoon couple were fine. I found that out later they'd written to the local paper, both unhurt, said they'd never forget the soldier who told a complete stranger's mother that help was coming and made it sound like a promise he personally intended to keep. The man with the yellow roses for his wife, I never found out about him. I've looked. I hope he got home. I hope she got her flowers. I think about it more than is reasonable. The 2 children lived. Theo and the little girl, whose name I learned was Priya. Not a scratch on either of them in the end, which seems impossible given where they'd been standing. But children are made of rubber and luck, and on that day they had both. Their mothers found each other afterwards. They became friends, the 2 families, bonded forever by the worst morning of their lives and by the same young man who'd carried both their children out of the dark with his back turned to the danger. I know that because I went to the thing they held the year after, but that's getting ahead of myself. What I haven't told you yet is what happened when it was all over. When the cordon was up and the wounded were away, and the road was full of serious men doing serious work, and Lance Corporal Whitlock had given his report, and there was, for the first time in over an hour, nothing left for him to do. I watched him then. I couldn't stop watching him by that point. And what he did next is the part of the story that changed how I see people. The part I tell last because it's the part that lasts. When it was over, when there was nothing left for him to do, Lance Corporal Whitlock walked back to his post. That's what he did. I want you to sit with that because I had to. He'd run into smoke. He'd carried 2 children out. He'd knelt beside a dozen strangers and held them together with nothing but his voice. And when the professionals had it in hand, when the officers tried to walk him to an ambulance to look at the cut on his head, he shook them off, quiet and polite, and he walked back across the road to the patch of ground he'd been standing on when the world blew apart. And he took up his position. Feet planted, rifle upright, eyes front. He went back to being a statue. A police officer tried to tell him the post wasn't there anymore, not really, that nobody expected him to stand a ceremonial guard in the middle of a bomb site. And Whitlock said something I only heard about secondhand, but it stayed with me word for word the way the woman who heard it repeated it. He said, "Somebody's got to be standing here when the families look back." That was it. Somebody's got to be standing here when the families look back. And he stood. Dust on his shoulders, blood on his ear, the smell of burning still in the air. He stood his post like it was the most ordinary morning in the world because he had worked out something the rest of us hadn't. He'd worked out that the standing was the point. That a frightened person, looking back over their shoulder at the place that had nearly killed them, needed to see one thing that hadn't moved. One fixed point. One man who was still where he was supposed to be. That's why the boy had walked to him in the first place. Theo, 4 years old with his whole little world knocked sideways, had looked across that ruined road and chosen the one thing that was still standing. The statue. And the statue had turned out to be the safest place on the street. I've turned that over for a year and more, and I don't think I'll ever get to the bottom of it. We mock them, the guards. We treat the stillness like a joke, a tourist game, a man pretending to be a thing. But the stillness is a promise. It says, "Whatever happens, I will be here." And most days that promise costs nothing. It's just a young man standing in the cold being photographed by strangers. And then one day in 100 years, it costs everything. And it turns out to be the only promise that mattered. They tried to give him a medal, of course they did. There were stories in the papers, the soldier who stood his post, photographs of him taken by people who'd been there, grainy, off-center, his back to the smoke with a child clamped to his chest. The country wanted a hero and he'd handed them a perfect one. And by every account I heard, Whitlock hated it, hated the attention. He went very quiet whenever it came up. There's a clip of him from later, an interview he plainly didn't want to give, and a journalist asks him how it felt to be a hero, and he looks at her for a long moment and says, "The people who didn't make it home, you should be asking about them, not me. I just did my job." And he meant it. You could see he meant it. He wasn't being modest for the cameras. He genuinely could not understand why everyone was making a fuss about a man, for doing the thing he'd spent 4 years being trained to do. That's the part I find hardest to explain to people. He didn't think he'd done anything special. To him, the special thing would have been not doing it. To him, running into the smoke wasn't brave, it was just what you did. It was the floor, the baseline, the minimum, and the idea of standing still and watching a child walk into danger was so far outside what he was that it never even occurred to him as an option. We called it courage because for us it would have been. For him, it was just Tuesday. And I've come to think that's the truest kind of courage there, is the kind that doesn't feel like courage from the inside. That feels like the only thing a person could possibly do. The road reopened eventually. They rebuilt the bit of wall that had come down. They put up a small plaque low on the railings, easy to miss, the way the British do these things, no fuss, just names and a date and a few words. Tourists walk past it every day without seeing it. I see it every day. I went back to my flower stall in the end. People asked me why. They said, how can you stand on that corner after what happened there? Doesn't it haunt you? And I'd say, that's exactly why I stand there. Same reason he did. Somebody's got to be where they're supposed to be. I sold flowers there for 3 more years before my knees made me stop. And every single one of those years on the day, I'd put a bunch of red carnations at the foot of that plaque before I opened up. Red because of the balloon. I never told anyone why red. I'm telling you now. The year after, the families held a gathering. Nothing grand. A church hall, sandwiches, urns of tea, the kind of do where everybody wears their good coat and nobody quite knows what to say. They invited the people who'd been there. I almost didn't go. I felt like I had no right. I'd only sold flowers. I hadn't carried anyone out of anything. But Theo's mother found my name somehow and rang me up and said, "You held my husband's friend's hand on the curb. You sat with strangers. You come. You've every right." So I went. Whitlock was there. He nearly didn't come either, I heard. He'd left the army by then. He'd done his time and got out, quiet as he did everything, gone back up north to that town nobody had heard of, and word was he didn't much like coming back to London, that the city pulled the day back up in him in a way he couldn't manage. But the families asked him, and you don't say no to those families, so he came. In a plain jacket. No uniform, no cap. Just a tall young man in a room full of people who owed him more than they could ever say. And Theo went to him. Theo was 5 by then, nearly 6, and he'd been told the story so many times that the man had become a sort of legend in his small life, the soldier who carried him. And when he saw Whitlock across the room, he didn't run. He went shy, hiding behind his mum's leg the way he'd hidden a year before, peeking out. And Whitlock crouched down. Right down to the boy's level, knees on the church hall floor, and he didn't say anything clever. He just held out his hand to shake, very serious, very formal, like he was meeting a fellow soldier. And Theo looked at the hand and looked at his mum and looked back at the hand, and then he ignored it completely and threw his arms round the man's neck and held on. And Lance Corporal Daniel Whitlock, who'd stood like stone through a bomb, who'd carried 2 children out of the smoke and never broken, who told a journalist he was nothing special and meant it, that man knelt on a church hall floor with a 5-year-old's arms round his neck, and he broke. Quietly. His shoulders went and he put one big hand on the back of the boy's head and he held him and he cried. No sound. Just the shaking. And the whole room saw it, and the whole room looked away at the same moment, all of us, to give him that, because we understood it was the first time he'd let it out. A year of it. And a church hall full of strangers was somehow the safest place he'd found to set it down. That's the picture I keep. Not the smoke, not the running, not the dust on his shoulders. A man on his knees on a scuffed wooden floor holding the child he'd saved, finally allowed to be frightened now that the danger was a year behind him. The statue weeping. The bravest man I ever saw, undone by a 5-year-old's hug in the most ordinary room in the world. We went back to our lives. That's what people do. The families are still close. Theo and Priya grew up calling each other cousins, though they share no blood, only a mourning. The plaque is still there, still missed by the tourists, still found by the ones who know. And somewhere up north, in a town I've never been to, there's a man who will always wave away the word hero, who'll tell you he only did his job, and who is, I think, more right than he knows. Because he didn't do something extraordinary. He did the ordinary thing extraordinarily well. In the 1 second, the ordinary thing was the hardest thing on earth. And that's the whole of it. People ask me when I tell this what the lesson is. As if a morning like that comes with a lesson neat in a bow. I don't think it does. But if you pushed me, I'd say this. We are so quick to decide there's nothing behind another person's stillness. We see someone standing in the cold, doing their boring job, holding their boring post, and we decide their scenery. We wave our hands in their faces to see if anyone's home. And most of the time, we never find out who they really are, because most of the time nothing happens that asks them to show us. We just walk on past, certain we already know. I knew that guard for a year before I knew him at all. I'd watched him 1,000 times and seen nothing, because nothing was being asked of him, and I'd mistaken the quiet for emptiness. Then the world exploded and the quiet stood up and ran into the smoke, and I understood that I'd been walking past the bravest man I'd ever meet, every single day for the better part of a year, and I'd never once said good morning. So now I do, to all of them, every guard, every quiet one standing their post in the cold while the crowds wave hands in their faces. I look them in the eye and I say good morning, and I don't expect an answer and I don't get one, and that's fine. Because I know now what the stillness is. It isn't emptiness. It's a promise. And one day in 100 years, when everything you love is running the wrong way through the smoke, that promise might be the only thing left standing. I still can't walk past that corner without slowing down. I told you that at the start. I slow down and I look at the spot where he stood, and I think about a red balloon going up over the rooftops free with nobody hurt on the end of its ribbon. And I think, he never moved when it didn't matter. And then he moved, the one time it did. That's the whole story, that's the man. Somebody's got to be standing there when the families look back. He was. He always will be in my head on that corner in that coat, eyes front, perfectly still, the safest place on the whole gray street. Good morning, Lance Corporal. Wherever you are, good morning.